I am Illuscri, and this is From Nothing to Us. Book 1, From Nothing to Lucy. Preface. Before I set out on this probably lifelong journey, it's best I establish why and how I'm doing this. One day, back in 2022, I was reading a book by the Pacific Ocean. The waves crashed fresh against the cliffs where I had cracked open the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. And growing in me was a vast sense of history. The depth and scale of it took hold of me, and armed with sudden inspiration, I opened my laptop and started a Word document that, though I'd left the project to gather dust for a year and a half, would become something much bigger than I suspected. A story of everything. This began as a dry history in my mind, but then I remembered that I love telling stories, so I figured why not combine the two? Too much of history is told in such a dull way. Reality is so dynamic and alive, and I want to admit that side of history as much as I can. Not to say that there aren't dynamic and alive histories out there, but I wanted to add to that corpus in a way that's probably way too ambitious for my own good, but I'm gonna try my best. So, the current state of the project was born, as full and connected a story of everything as I can make it. And I mean everything, from the Big Bang to the present day, from nothing to us even. This will understandably be a huge project, especially since I've prepared a rough outline of 16 books to cover it all. As the scope of the project may change with time, expect that plan to change, especially since I'm now rethinking that plan and am considering adding 2 more books, making it 18. But we'll see. For reference, these internet episodes, podcasts, whatever, each correspond to a chapter, and each season to a book. I only have a rough idea of how long the first book will take. The other books will most likely end up being far longer, and I suspect the later ones may have to be split even further. The current state of this project was in different parts inspired by various history podcasts, you might have been able to guess, like Mike Duncan's History of Rome, of course, Robin Pearson's History of Byzantium, Dominic Perry's The History of Egypt, and Chris Hasler's History of the World, the latter being the biggest inspiration if you couldn't tell. I do borrow a fair bit from that podcast's format. You might notice the volumes correspond to books, chapters correspond to episodes, stuff like that. Though, of course, I'm starting from a much earlier point, and the style's going to be a lot different. And really, massive kudos to everyone who I just mentioned. They make very good podcasts. I highly recommend them. Go check them out. And as far as books go, Gibbon's Decline of Rome, which I still haven't finished yet, and the Durant's Story of Civilization, which I haven't even started yet, also factored majorly in kickstarting this project. As for now, the first book, From Nothing to Lucy, covers from the beginning of the universe through the formation of the Earth, the beginning of life and all its journeys, and ending with the evolution of Australopithecus. As you might notice, no humans. Just pure space and physics and life. It'll last for around 30 to 35 chapters, I'm suspecting, but that is wont to change. I have no promises for how often I'll release chapters, unfortunately. I'm going to try for once every 2 weeks, but it really just depends on how much research I have to do for each chapter's topic. But the goal is once every 2 weeks, if not once every week. We'll see once I start getting into the rhythm of things. The next book will start with some hominids. It'll go through the evolution of our species through the Ice Ages, the advent of farming in certain areas, and ending with the earliest writing we know of. That one will be titled From Lucy to Kushim. I think that's how you pronounce that word. I haven't looked it up yet. I am planning on pronouncing all of these names and labels and place names and all that stuff as accurately as I can. I'll go more into that in a moment. Past that, it's less determined. I want to end the third book at the late Bronze Age collapse, but I still have yet to finalize who it will be. I suspect it'll be a couple years before I even have to worry about it, so that's good. The fourth book will cover until around 220 BCE, and from there it'll cover successively smaller chunks of time until we reach the modern age, and each book covers only a handful of decades. So yeah, that's the plan, mostly laid out as it is currently. I suppose I should introduce myself, the host. I call myself Uluscri, that is Uluscri. It's a little bit of an unconventional name, but the whole meaning of it and how I came to create it in the first place is detailed in a video on my main channel, which I'll describe a little later. It is not my real name, more a public persona. I'm an early 20s writer from the US who has way too many projects keeping them occupied. I have a fantasy novel on its way to being ready to self publish, and a YouTube channel entitled Uluscri for all of my world building / writing stuff. But that's not relevant to this. The more I go through life, the more my interest in history grows. I used to be a major science person, and to an extent I still am, but now I find myself being pointed towards how we got here. Not just stories, but the people and the lives that brought us to this point. An endless list of whys and whos. I've thrown around the idea of making historical video essays on people and events I find interesting. The problem is that A, there's an endless amount of context you need to fully understand everything, and inevitably you're dragged into prehistory. And B, editing video essays, though fun, is too time demanding for me in my busy schedule. So this podcast series was naturally born. All the context I could need, and I don't doubt I'll get around to many of those stories I find really interesting. And of course, I'll happen upon many a gem in my research, I suspect. Otherwise, I'm an avid reader, though I admittedly read pretty slowly. Um, it takes me a fair amount of time to get through any book that's more than like 300 pages. I'm also an amateur photographer, world builder, and of course, writer. And that's basically all you need to know about my personal aspects. If you have any specific questions, then feel free to ask me. I'll have a list of places where you can reach me at the end of this chapter. To a certain extent, history itself is a form of fiction. That's leaving out a lot of nuance, but it's not wholly untrue, I feel. This work is just more fiction than other histories, which is to say, if you want full accuracy and further depth than I go into, I recommend you read papers and books published by degree-wielding historians. They'll do a lot better than I could do in that department. This is primarily a work of storytelling, after all, and I am very wont to get things wrong. Which is not to say that I'm going to throw accuracy fully out the window. I still want to stay as accurate as I can be, and I'll still be researching as much as I can be. But if I cut corners, then I cut corners. I want to present history on a personal level, from the point of view of the people and states that lived through these events. And yes, I say states, for though the people at their heads make the biggest decisions, and will still get their POVs told, the story of humanity is not complete without considering the grander motions of whole peoples. I'm not a proponent of the great man theory of history. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. And, the shiftings of demographics and populations and climate and culture all have their own parts to play in this grand story. which means taking the wider picture most of the time, though I suspect there will be chances to sit back and relax with a deeper look into someone's life or into a specific event. This is all to say that I'll be hopping around the planet back and forth, along with the story ballooning to unwieldy lengths at times. I want to include as much as I can while still making these books finishable, though inevitably it will still take me years to write each one, even with all that I'll have to leave out. That's all just what I suspect, though. It could change in the telling. I don't know, maybe it could take a little shorter. But anyways, making this accurate is important, but expect me to get some things wrong, which doesn't even include the many times when I will have to make vague motions at the truth, when historians themselves aren't sure. And when that happens, which, spoiler alert, is a lot of the time, most of the time actually, I'll make it painfully obvious. Expect plenty of abouts before dates and lists of prevailing theories. At the very least, I don't want to purposefully embellish anything. More important, though, is the fullness of writing the story from their POVs. That means as few anachronistic terms as possible. And for anyone who doesn't know what anachronistic means, that's basically terms that we in the present day attach to people in the past. For instance, we use the name Egypt when referring to that ancient civilization, when the people living in that civilization back then would not have called it Egypt. So yeah, as few anachronistic terms as possible. And of course, I will have to use modern terms for things when we have no original source for what those people would have referred to themselves as, like most of the Ice Age cultures, so I'll have to use the modern terms for that. But building on that as well, no greater analysis, no implications for what something means for today's society or like through the future of history. I want it to just be a telling of how they would have viewed the world and the events happening around and to them. Make it as real as possible. Make it as if it is happening as I'm writing it. So there's no hindsight, nothing like that. Of course, you won't be familiar with all the units of measure used by every culture throughout time, and though I will still be using those during the telling, I'll include a list of all the units converted to their SI equivalents at the beginning of each chapter they're used in, for all of our sakes. There's also the issue of sources and whether or not to include them. As I want the information to be accurate, there's an obvious incentive to cite sources as I go, but this work is very much not one of historical rigor. I am not a historian, as I've said. I'm a storyteller at heart, and so I almost feel like it would be out of place if I tried putting sources after every, quote, fact I write down, especially with all the colorful words that'll be surrounding them. A good compromise I've come up with is having a list of further reading at the end of each chapter. In the case of YouTube or podcast episodes, they'll be in the description. For this book, there's few things even resembling people until the very end, and so you may worry that this will be one of those dry histories I said this wouldn't be. Well, didn't you listen to me? I don't want this to be dry, and so it won't be. In telling the story of the universe, the earth, and life, I want to add poetry to the science, character to the inanimate, life to the life, as there should be. All that being said, I believe I hear something massive, yet small, rumbling in the near future. I should get to that. To nothing, then. Thank you for listening. The first proper episode should be posted at the same time this one goes out. It goes from the Big Bang to the first atoms, and I hope it brings you some sort of value. If you're listening to this as a podcast on Spotify or any of the other apps, There is a YouTube version of this show titled The Same Thing if you prefer to see some pictures as you watch. However, you're listening to this, there should be some sort of comment system. I know Spotify has a way where you can like ask questions about the show, but that can function as a comment system as well. YouTube obviously has a comment system. I may even read out your comment at the end of the episode in this section, in the sort of outro section. Especially if you have just like a little question, I'm happy to answer those. Oh, and I forgot to mention that I do have a website titled aluscri.neocities.net. I'll have it linked in the description, and I'll also spell it out for you right now. So that is ULUSCRI dot NEOCITIES.net. And that is my personal website. It has a lot of things that pertain to me, but relevant to this show, I want to have a section there just completely dedicated to From Nothing to Us. It'll have relevant pictures, maps, anything like that. I want to try to compile a timeline. I think that would be something that'd be really cool. And yeah, if I remember anything else, then I'll make sure to say it in future episodes. But as for now, goodbye, and make sure to absorb the world some today.